Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're cracking open something that might seem a bit, well, dry at first glance, standard operating procedures or SOPs. But trust me, this is way more interesting than it sounds. We're diving into this KPexOne toolkit, and let me tell you, it's like the ultimate guide to getting things done right consistently every single time.
Oh, yeah.
Expert speaker, I know you're passionate about systems thinking. What's got you so excited about SOPs?
You hit the nail on the head when you said getting things done right. You wouldn't believe how many organizations struggle with this. In fact, studies show nearly 70% of SOP implementations fail because they don't have buy-in from the top. This toolkit tackles that head-on. What's fascinating to me is how much psychology and communication goes into making SOPs work. It's not just about writing down steps. It's about understanding how people learn and how to create systems that truly stick.
Okay, so forget the dusty old manuals we've all seen gathering dust on a shelf somewhere. This toolkit sounds like it's taking a fresh approach. So where does it all begin? Is it just about creating a document?
Well, yes, there's a document involved, but it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. This guidance document is all about customization. They compare it to a recipe book, but honestly, I think it's more like building a custom software program for your organization.
Oh, wow.
You're taking into account your unique needs, your culture, your specific ingredients, so to speak.
So it's really tailored to each organization. But what about the actual writing? Do SOPs have to be super formal and, sound like a robot wrote them?
That's a common misconception. The toolkit stresses clear, concise writing, absolutely. But it also recognizes that people learn in different ways.
Uh-huh.
They actually suggest using pictures for visual learners. I mean, can you imagine an SOP manual with illustrations? Almost like a graphic novel for getting things done.
Now, that's an image I can get behind. I've got to admit, that makes SOP seem way more approachable, but it can't be a set it and forget it type of deal, right? Things are constantly changing.
You're absolutely right. The toolkit hammers home the point that SOPs need to be living documents. Think about it. New technologies emerge, laws change, even internal processes evolve. If you're not updating your SOPs to reflect these changes, they're about as useful as an outdated map. You're going to get lost.
Okay, so update those maps. But when it comes to the format of those SOPs, what are we talking about here? Are we talking paragraphs, bullet points, flowcharts? What's the recommended style?
This is where it gets really interesting. The KPexOne toolkit outlines 5 distinct formats: simple steps, hierarchical steps, a graphic format, pictures only, and even flowcharts. They actually provide guidance on choosing the best format depending on how complex the task is.
It's all about having the right tool for the job, right? Like you wouldn't use a hammer to screw in a light bulb.
Exactly. And the choice of format is critical. I've seen organizations really struggle with this. They'll try to cram a complex procedure into a simple checklist, and it just doesn't work. Or they'll go overboard with a flowchart for something that could be explained in a few bullet points.
So how do you avoid those pitfalls? Let's say I'm in charge of implementing all of this at my company. Where do I even begin?
Well, before you even start writing, you need to build a solid foundation. And according to this toolkit, that foundation rests on 2 pillars: buy-in and a designated champion.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. What exactly do they mean by buy-in?
Buy-in is about getting everyone on board, from the CEO down to the frontline workers. It's about leadership, championing the process, demonstrating its value, and really embedding it into the company culture. Because if people see SOPs as just another bureaucratic hurdle, they're not going to embrace them.
Makes sense. You need that enthusiasm, that sense of ownership. So who's this designated champion they're talking about? Is this like the SOP superhero?
Exactly. You need someone who is accountable for the success of this whole thing. They're the ones who are going to drive the implementation process, ensure the SOPs are developed and maintained, and be the go-to person for any questions or issues.
Sounds like a pretty big job, but even with a superhero on your side, you can't tackle every single process at once, right?
You're absolutely right. And that's where prioritization comes in. The toolkit offers a really practical 4-step process for figuring out where to focus your efforts. You want to look at areas where there's a high risk of errors, where processes are particularly complex, or where inefficiencies are causing significant problems. Start with the low-hanging fruit, the areas where you can make the biggest difference quickly, and then build from there.
So start small, celebrate those wins, and use that momentum to tackle the bigger challenges. I love that approach.
It's all about building a sustainable system. And speaking of systems, the toolkit also emphasizes the importance of having a centralized location for all your SOPs. Could be electronic or a hard copy, but the key is having a clear numbering system and easy access for everyone.
Version control, so important. And speaking of control, How do you make sure this whole system actually works, that people are following the SOPs and that it all stays up to date?
That's where governance comes in. You need a formal structure with clear roles and responsibilities clearly communicated to everyone involved. Think of it as the guardrails that keep everything on track.
So you've got the foundation, the champion, the prioritization strategy, the central repository, and the governance structure. It sounds like this toolkit is really comprehensive. It's amazing how much thought and detail goes into creating and maintaining effective SOPs.
It might seem like overkill for something as seemingly simple as a set of instructions, but
So
when you think about the potential for errors, inconsistencies, and inefficiencies, the value of a well-structured SOP system becomes crystal clear.
I'm definitely seeing SOPs in a whole new light now.
That's what I love about these deep dives. We're uncovering the hidden complexities of everyday things. We've talked about writing styles and formats, the critical role of buy-in, and a designated champion, how to prioritize effectively, and the importance of a central repository and robust governance.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork. Now let's dive into the specifics of those 5 different SOP formats and how to choose the right one for the job. But before we move on to the next section, I want to highlight something that really stood out to me.
You mentioned something earlier about choosing the right tool for the job, and that's spot on when it comes to SOP formats.
Yeah.
You wouldn't use a screwdriver to hammer in a nail.
Right, exactly. So when you're looking at these 5 formats, what are the key things you need to consider to make sure you're picking the best one?
The KPexOne toolkit actually breaks it down into 2 main factors. How many decisions does the person following the SOP need to make? And how many steps are involved in the whole process?
Okay, so if it's a pretty straightforward task with minimal decision points, you could use the simple steps format.
Right. Think of it like a checklist for a morning routine. Brush teeth, make coffee, walk the dog.
Yeah.
But for those longer procedures with more than 10 steps, you might need to level up to a hierarchical steps format, or maybe even bring in some visuals with the graphic format.
And what about procedures that involve a lot of decision making?
That's where flowcharts really shine. They're fantastic for visually mapping out all those different branches and potential outcomes.
I've got to admit, flowcharts sometimes feel a bit old school, but I can definitely see how powerful they can be for the right type of process.
They definitely have their place. And this toolkit really emphasizes understanding the strengths and weaknesses of each format so you can match it to the task at hand. Of these 5 formats, which one do you find most organizations struggle with and why?
That's a great question. Based on my experience, I'd say the hierarchical steps format often trips people up. It's that balance between providing enough detail without overwhelming the reader. It's easy to get lost in the weeds.
I've seen that happen too. It's like trying to climb a mountain without a clear trail. You need those well-defined steps and sub-steps to guide you.
Speaking of guidance, this toolkit seems to be a treasure trove of practical advice. You mentioned something earlier about the KPexOne platform. What role does that play in this whole SOP ecosystem?
It's not just about creating those documents. It's about having a system to manage them, store them, update them, and make sure everyone has access to the right versions. This platform basically helps organizations institutionalize their SOPs, making sure they're integrated into the daily operations.
So it's not just a file folder or a shared drive somewhere. It's a dedicated platform designed specifically for managing SOPs.
Precisely. And it can be a game changer. Think about the headaches of version control tracking updates, ensuring everyone is on the same page. This platform takes care of all that.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about that crucial buy-in we discussed earlier. You mentioned it's not just about telling people to follow the new procedures, it's about something more. What does that look like in practice?
It's about painting a vision, helping people understand why these SOPs are important, how they benefit not just the organization as a whole, but also the individual. It's about addressing those unspoken fears or concerns people might have about change.
So it's not just top-down communication, it's about engaging people in a dialogue.
Exactly. And a really effective way to do that, involve people in the SOP development process. Get input from the folks who are actually doing the work. That sense of ownership can make all the difference in the world.
And once you have that buy-in, you need someone to lead the charge, right? That designated champion we were talking about. What qualities are essential for that role? What would you look for if you were hiring an SOP champion?
First and foremost, you need someone who is incredibly organized and detail-oriented, someone who thrives on process and structure, but they also need to be a strong communicator, someone who can collaborate effectively with people at all levels of the organization, from the executive team to the frontline staff.
It sounds like finding the right champion is crucial to the success of the entire implementation. And it makes me think about the challenge of prioritizing. You can't tackle every single process at once. How does the toolkit guide organizations through that decision-making process?
They have this really insightful four-step approach to prioritization. First, identify the high-risk areas, then pinpoint the processes that are causing the biggest headaches or bottlenecks. Next, look for opportunities to streamline and simplify existing procedures. And finally, don't forget to celebrate those early wins. Those small victories can create momentum and build excitement for the rest of the implementation process.
I can see how celebrating those wins would be a great way to keep everyone engaged and motivated.
Absolutely. And this ties back to something we discussed earlier about the psychology of learning and motivation. When people feel like they're making progress, they're more likely to stick with it.
So true. Now, we've talked a lot about the how of implementing SOPs, but I'm curious about the why. Why are SOPs so important in the first place? What are the real tangible benefits that organizations can expect to see?
I'm glad you asked that, because sometimes it's easy to get caught up in the mechanics and lose sight of the bigger picture. SOPs aren't just about creating order and consistency, they're about reducing errors, improving efficiency, and mitigating risks.
And all of that translates to a healthier bottom line, right?
Absolutely. But it goes beyond just financial benefits.
Yeah.
SOPs can also enhance employee morale and job satisfaction. When people know what's expected of them and have clear guidelines to follow, they feel more confident and empowered.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, I know we're about to wrap up part 2 of this deep dive, but before we do, I want to touch on something that really resonated with me in this toolkit. They talk about the importance of clarity and accessibility when it comes to writing SOPs. They actually make the point that an SOP should be so clear that someone with limited experience or knowledge could successfully follow it without any hand-holding.
I love that. No more relying on tribal knowledge or vague instructions passed down through the grapevine. The goal is to empower anyone to perform the task correctly and consistently, simply by following the SOP.
That's a powerful idea. It's like democratizing knowledge within the organization.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it ties back to what we were discussing earlier about different learning styles. The toolkit encourages writers to really think about their audience and how they learn best.
Hmm?
If you've got a team with a lot of visual learners, pictures and diagrams are your best friends. And for those who thrive on step-by-step instructions, the hierarchical format is probably going to be a winner.
It's incredible how much they've considered the human element in all of this. It's not just about systems and processes, it's about people.
Absolutely. At the end of the day, SOPs are tools for communication and learning. They're about transferring knowledge and empowering people to do their best work.
And let's not forget that creating those initial SOPs is just the beginning. We talked about the importance of keeping them updated and relevant. How does the toolkit address that ongoing maintenance challenge?
They're big on proactive reviews. They recommend reviewing SOPs anytime there's a change in legislation procedures, technology, or even internal processes. Don't wait for things to break before you fix them.
So it's an ongoing process, not a one-time project.
Oh.
What's a realistic time frame for reviewing all SOPs?
They suggest a systematic review of all SOPs perhaps every 2 years, just to make sure everything is aligned with current practices. It sounds daunting, but remember, you don't have to do it all at once. You can break it down into smaller, manageable chunks.
Okay, let's talk storage and access. We've touched on this briefly, but it's so crucial. What's the best way to make sure these SOPs are easily accessible to everyone who needs them?
The toolkit really emphasizes the importance of that central repository, whether it's electronic or hard copy, with a clear numbering system for easy retrieval. This ensures that everyone is working from the most up-to-date version and avoids any confusion about which SOP to follow. And of course, clear version control is key.
Version control, every organization's nemesis. Any tips on how to prevent people from accidentally using outdated versions?
Clear labeling is essential. Make sure each version is clearly labeled and indicate the revision number and date on every page. And if you're using an electronic system, utilize those access controls to ensure that only authorized personnel can make changes.
It all comes back to clarity and consistency, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The toolkit emphasizes establishing a system where everyone understands the processes, knows where to find the information, and is confident in following the right procedures.
It's been fascinating to explore this toolkit and see how much strategic thinking goes into designing an effective SOP system. It's definitely not just about writing down some steps. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the key takeaway you want our listener to walk away with today?
SOPs are so much more than just boring documents. They're a reflection of an organization's values, its commitment to quality and efficiency, and its understanding of how people learn and collaborate. And here's a final thought for our listener. We've been talking about SOPs in a business context, But these principles of clarity, consistency, and continuous improvement can be applied to any area of life. Think about your own personal goals or projects. Could you benefit from having well-defined procedures? Something to ponder.
That's such a great point. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of SOPs. Until next time.